Why did Japan declare war on the United States in 1941? After all, the Japanese were at least to a certain degree aware of the US industrial power. Something I showed in a video on my main channel where you can see the commissioning of warships from both sides in a time-lapse. So why did they do it? Well, the answer is not so straightforward as I initially thought, and a big thank you here to Justin for giving me vital feedback on my structure and providing me with additional sources. Anyway, let's get started. The first major set of factors I call the quest for self-sufficiency. Japan as an island is quite isolated and also lacks many resources, even if one accounts for the additional territories back then. This became one of the driving factors in the expansion of the empire. Now, before the First World War, Japan had to give limited thought about acquiring essential resources during wartime, since in every war waged since 1815, neutral powers had supplied the belligerents with necessary financing and materials. Since many conflicts were rather short, the military focused more on rapid mobilization plans and less on preparing the economy for an extended conflict. Well, the situation changed in the First World War. There were no neutrals. War was sure to last more than a year, perhaps for longer. Belligerents who were not self-reliant were lost. The chief of the important military affairs section in the army ministry observed in Tokyo it was no longer enough that Japan was able to construct its own warships and artillery pieces. The nation now needed secure access to iron ore and other necessary items. The Japanese also translated a study on how the Germans tried to reach self-sufficiency during wartime. Analyzing the Japanese situation, the conclusion was that there were simply not enough resources in the home islands in Formosa, Korea, and South Sakhalin that back then were part of the empire. As such, it was necessary to acquire territories with more resources. This is where China comes in. The conflict between Japan and China is very complicated and I cannot go into any details here. For the sake of this video, we look mainly at the resource motivation. Yet keep in mind that it would be a mistake, however, to see Japanese policy in China working as a smoothly running juggernaut, guided by a single clearly fixed plan devised over the decades. On the contrary, there were simply too many Japanese actors and would-be actors on the China stage to effect such a coherent policy. Thus buffeted by contending interest groups, Japan's China policies tended to lurch from one objective to another. There were some in Japan that wanted to cooperate with China, whereas others wanted to go to war with China. Yet ultimately, after a small yet extremely influential battle known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War started, although initially both sides wanted to limit the fighting, and the war with China was going to dominate in many aspects Japanese policy, but more on this later. Now it is time to bring in the United States. As mentioned before, Japan was heavily dependent on imports, and most of it came from the United States. Yet the United States were not happy about the Sino-Japanese War or the expansion of the Japanese in East Asia. After the fall of France in 1940, the Japanese wanted to get their heads on French Indochina. Nowadays, this would be roughly the areas of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. The Japanese in September 1940 ordered troops into French Indochina. Reacting to these aggressive moves, on September 28, 1940, the United States embargoed scrap iron and steel shipments to Japan and underwrote a $25 million loan to China. The British reopened the Burma Road in mid-October because the immediate threat of German invasion had eased, and previous concessions to Japan seemed only to encourage extremists in Tokyo. Discarding its previous policy of appeasement, the British government also accounted a loan of $10 million to China. Further embargoes followed in 1941. In January 1941, the United States had embargoed copper and brass shipments to Japan. Tokyo's attempt to secure oil from Netherlands East Indies had foundered, as the Dutch stalled repeatedly in the negotiations. In mid-June, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had announced that domestic oil shortages compelled the United States to stop shipping oil to Japan from the US East Coast ports. Yet these resources were necessary for the Japanese to continue the war against China. Another factor is related to this, something I covered a few years ago in a video that explained why the German victories in Europe and the Second World War additionally hurt the Japanese. To a certain degree, the US embargoes might have been circumvented, yet the war in Europe took away suppliers and their ships. In 1939, after the outbreak of war in Europe, in 3 months the total ship tonnage of all nations in the Far Eastern waters dropped from 4.5 million tons to 3.2 million tons. The remainder are almost entirely Japanese. In the spring of 1940, the German invasion of Denmark and Norway resulted in the removal by Britain of almost all the few remaining Scandinavian ships in the Far East. In short, Japan entered a war with China, which required more shipping to supply the troops, and a large chunk of European shipping capacity was removed in late 1939 to mid-1940. As such, the Japanese shipping capacities were strained. This also affected the availability of food. Sugar had been rationed since December 1940, rice 2 months later, other commodities as fruit, vegetables, salt and even matches progressively added to the list. When general food ration began in February 1942, the average daily intake was already less than 60% of most Americans. The next major set of factors are what I call structural problems. These factors cover mostly the lack of civilian oversight, power of the military and the general attitude of the military. First off, there was little to no civilian oversight. Although the Japanese had a position that is usually translated with Prime Minister, the literal translation of Shuhan would be head position in a group, according to Frank. Yet the main problem was that he was not as powerful neither in the government nor the cabinet. Additionally, critically, the Prime Minister did not select the army or naval minister. That power resided in the services themselves. Furthermore, the resignation of any army or navy minister automatically toppled the government, thus bestowing a military veto over civilian authority. Yeah, what could possibly go wrong with such a setting? But you know what? This is just a setup for the structural problems. It gets a bit more dicey when you get a better understanding of the Imperial Japanese military attitude. Most of you might know that the Imperial Japanese Navy and Imperial Japanese Army had extreme version of inter-service rivalry going on. This was also reflected by them looking in completely different directions. The army was for the so-called Northern strategy that was aimed against Russia, or at that point the Soviet Union, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was a proponent of the Southern strategy, with the main opponents being the United States of America and the United Kingdom. Since there was no civilian or any other oversight, this resulted in a defense, or probably better, war policy that was fractured. The Imperial Army neglected the Anglo-American powers and thus possessed little understanding of them. The Imperial Navy looked outward and indeed around the globe. Its gaze naturally fell upon the Royal and United States navies as measuring sticks of power and justification for resources. Since at least 1905, this basic divide left Japan with no coherent national defense policy, as each service prepared only for war with its own envisioned opponent. Yet this is probably far not the worst about the Imperial Japanese military. There was something far more problematic. Japan was going a bit through a rough time and the military was not particularly nice to each other. Between 1930 and 1936, there were 20 major domestic terrorist incidents, 4 political assassinations, 5 planned assassinations, and 4 attempted coups. The March and October incident of 1939, the May 15 incident of 1932, and the Great Military Mutiny of February 1936. Furthermore, the army's continual plotting in Manchuria and North China destabilized those regions and helped isolate Japan internationally. Now, the Japanese military managed to get some of those groups on shorter leash, but it was clearly not short enough. Even after the control group in the Imperial Japanese Army brought most outrages under control, the threat of direct action suasion continued, to the point that lives of Princess Konoe, Admiral Yamamoto and even Prime Minister Tojo were threatened at various times before and during the war. This is also the reason why I find it rather interesting if people bring up the so-called peace faction when it comes to the end of the Second World War, because this faction had little to nothing to say and the military did not get particularly more reasonable over the war, something discussed in this video. There was another issue with the military, which is in a way already hinted at. They like to solve problems by escalation. Now there are several ways to escalate and also different intensities, and in this case they went with 100 points on a 1 to 10 scale. The Imperial Japanese Army universal solution of Plan Scott Aubrey was escalation. It applied it to a stupendous scale on 7th to 8th December 1941 in an attempt to halt Western aid to China and expropriate the entirety of East Indies oil production. As we might have suspected, China comes up again. The next set of factors I called psychological factors. Let us begin with the fact that the Japanese were under some kind of siege mentality. Namely, they felt quite threatened by the outside world. Now, though I can understand to a certain degree to be threatened by the United States and the British Empire, I must admit I have raised an eyebrow when reading about China and definitely raised a dozen when I read about the Netherlands. By 1941, the fleet faction ideology infected most middle echelon officers in the Imperial Navy. They pressed for policies they recognized would likely lead to war with not only the Netherlands and Great Britain but also the United States. Their vocabulary featured incarnations that this path was mandated for Japanese self-existence and self-defense against the encirclement by the ABCD, American, British, Chinese, and Dutch powers. More cautious senior officers, however, presented the service policies to army counterparts as war preparations without war determination. Army officers suspected that the Imperial Navy was merely feigning intention to go to war to sustain its claim to a predominance of national arms resources. This is of course related to the self-sufficiency aspect as well. Another factor was the general public. Although there were some attempts to negotiate a settlement with the United States that might have prevented a war, this would have required certain concessions. Yet, as Nomura explained, the Japanese government must be able to present to the Japanese people some reward for their sacrifices in China, or some alternative attractive gain. Another historian has pointed out that thanks to the government educational indoctrination and manipulation of the press, the public was more jingoistic than Japan's top leaders from 1931 to 1941. The Japanese leadership was in many ways aware about the power of the United States, although there are quite many different accounts on this. So first off, let us look at two very different assessments. From August to mid-October 1941, key army and naval leaders left ample evidence of their sound individual grasp of the situation, starkly at contrast with the customary strident facades in council. On the 27th August 1941, a delegation from the Total War Research Institute presented the cabinet with the rigorous analysis concluding that Japan must necessarily lose a war with the United States. The attentive Minister of War Tojo grew noticeably pale, as though his worst fears had been confirmed. As the presentation paralleled the reports Tojo had perused for the War Ministry and Intelligence Section of the Army General Staff, he attempted to rebut the conclusions by arguing it omitted intangibles like unpredictability. 2 days later, the War Guidance Office of the Army General Staff General predicted Cornell, Prime Minister from July 1940 to October 1941, would cave to US demands, but deemed this better than war. Yet another source notes the following. The balance of strength equation was very much on the minds of the Army and Navy planners. We wouldn't have gone to war, says an Army General Staff Operations Staff Officer, if we had been convinced beforehand that we were going to lose. Yet there is another very important point here. We need to consider again China. The Japanese were heavily invested in the conflict, and any solution with the United States would have required giving up in one way or another on China. This would not have only meant an end for the quest of self-sufficiency, it would have also been a public defeat and also not received well by the public neither. Additionally, there's a psychology here. You see, the Japanese already had heavily invested in China. If they would give up on that, this investment was in vain. This is known as the sunk cost fallacy. And in this case, I will quote Wikipedia for a change. People demonstrate a greater tendency to continue an endeavor once an investment in money, effort, or time has been made. This is the sunk cost fallacy, and such behavior may be described as throwing good money after bad, while refusing to succumb to what may be described as cutting one's losses. The obsession with China becomes also apparent if one looks at the infamous 14 parts message that the Japanese sent on the day they attacked Pearl Harbor. The memo was a bit short of 2,400 words. Netherlands is mentioned 6 times, Great Britain 10 times, Indochina 11 times, the United States 14 times, Japan 17 times, and China 21 times. Another important aspect to consider here is that in Japanese culture, especially military culture, there was a serious contempt for negotiations in general. As Hagakure, the Book of the Samurai, put it, calculating people are contemptible, for calculation deals with loss and gain might never stop. Death is considered loss and life is considered gain. Thus death is something that such a wretched person does not care for. Furthermore, scholars and their like are men who with wit and speech hide their own true cowardice and greed. As mentioned before, the Japanese military had a tendency to use escalation. Yet there's another aspect in here as well, namely that one might acknowledge that he cannot win, but still not give in. And this is probably best exemplified by the meeting of the chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff and the Emperor. On the last day of the month July 1940, Nagano went to see Emperor Hirohito at the palace carrying a New Year plan. The Navy Chief of Staff told Hirohito that the war with the United States should be avoided and that he was vehemently against the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, which he felt was obstructing Japan's diplomacy with the United States. But rather than suggesting a Japanese withdrawal from the pact, presumably because that would be a political decision that didn't concern him or the High Command, Nagano warned, if our petroleum supplies were cut off, we would lose our stock in 2 years. If a war broke out, we would use it all up in 18 months. To maximize Japan's chance for survival beyond that limited time frame, he concluded there was no choice but to strike. Could we expect a big victory such as our victory over Russia in the Sea of Japan? Hirohito asked. I'm uncertain as to any victory, Nagano replied, let alone the kind of huge victory won in the Sea of Japan. Of course, the not giving in aspect is one interpretation, and it can also be seen as a Hail Mary, which brings us to the final set of factors, which I called timing, and is connected to psychological factors as well. The first factor here was that the Japanese assumed that America would get stronger over time, and as such the time was in favor of the United States. The Japanese General Staff and War Ministry well understood the enormous latent power of the United States, but they expected that it would take the Americans several years to bring that full potential to bear. During that interval, Japan could secure territory and resources needed to fight a protracted war from advantageous forward positions, because the US military had already started its build-up. The sooner Japan acted, the better, because time was on the American side. Yet not only the Japanese didn't know that the United States would grow strong over time, so the precautious resource situation, the embargoes, the lack of ships, and the war in China, Japan was getting weaker. This also explains why Nagano insisted on striking soon as possible to maximize Japan's chance of survival. As previously mentioned, this was also seen by others in this way. On the 7th September 1941, Minister of War Tojo said that peace on American terms would mean the gradual impoverishment of Japan. Without a doubt, whereas war offered at least a 50-50 possibility of victory, that would be better, argued Tojo, than to be ground down without doing anything. Later in October, Tojo made the infamous jumping off the veranda quote. Now Frank took a closer look at the statement that refers to a particular temple, and he adds, prior to the banning of the practice, however, pilgrims would dive off the veranda on the superstitious belief that if you survived the fall, your wish would be granted. The 85% survival rate of the jumpers indicates a nuance in Tojo's comment, implying a gamble under very favorable odds that literal translation conceals. In November 1931, Tojo noted in a conference that if the Japanese would do nothing, that he assumed that we would become a third-class nation after 2 or 3 years if we merely sat tight. Of course, there's another important aspect when it comes to timing, namely that the Japanese were quite mesmerized by the victories that Germany had achieved so far in Europe. They had assumed at points that Great Britain was so close to defeat, as mentioned in my video on what the Japanese thought about the Germans. Additionally, this opened a window of opportunity, or better, windows of opportunity. The window actually had 4 parts: Hitler's defeat of the colonial powers in Europe, opening the window, the rapidly shifting naval balances, the US military buildup in the Philippines, and Japan's inelastic resource supplies in the face of Western sanctions potentially closing the window. The Two-Ocean Navy Act passed in July 1940 promised the US Navy 4 times the tonnage and 4 times the air power of Japan's. This meant Japan's relative naval strength would peak in late 1941 at near parity with the US Navy before rapidly declining. Over the summer of 1941, the United States had begun reinforcing the Philippines, which stood between Japan and the oil coveted in the Dutch East Indies. The blanket oil embargo imposed on 1st August 1941 by the United States, soon in cooperation with Great Britain and the Netherlands, threatened to shut down all Japanese military operations. Of course, we should not forget that a victory in such a war would mean that the Japanese would likely complete their quest for self-sufficiency, since on their mind was of course still China. Military strategy relied on classic short-term war scenario to seize and quickly eliminate Western bases in East Asia while occupying strategic points in the southern region. This in turn would hasten the collapse of Chiang Kai-shek's regime and end the China fighting. Japan would also cooperate with its Axis partners, Germany and Italy, to compel Great Britain to surrender, which would shatter America's will to fight. Although the army was bogged down in a protracted war in China, Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff Sugiyama informed Emperor Hirohito on December 1, 1941 that Japan had a once-in-a-lifetime chance to break the West's economic embargo and achieve autarky. Such leaps of faith were of course also influenced by Japanese history as well. For instance, the decisive victory in the Russo-Japanese War against the Russian fleet, the Battle of Tsushima, to which the Emperor was referring in one of the previous quotes. Well, let's wrap this up. The big underlying theme is that Japan's quest for self-sufficiency, which was one of the reasons that it was dragged into a war with China. This war with China created constant irritation background noise from 1937 onwards that in many aspects had influence on Japanese policy and additionally also damaged the international relations of Japanese empire as well. Not only did the war in China eat into Japanese resources, it also led to the US embargoes. The absence of civilian oversight in a combination with very aggressive military that could topple any civilian government by merely resigning severely limited any diplomatic options further, especially considering that the public also demanded results from the war in China. Not to mention that being not aggressively enough might also lead to being murdered. Various developments, namely the embargoes, the reduction of shipping capacity due to the war in Europe, and the ongoing war in China reduced Japanese options and would weaken their empire over time. At the same time, German victories in Europe opened a window of opportunity for the Japanese that would allow them to break the power of the West, then defeat China and also achieve self-sufficiency. The Japanese jumped at the window, but it turned out to be a wall, not of brick and mortar, yet steel and fire. Well, that was a bit more complicated than I expected. A big thank you here to Justin for providing many thoughts, some quotes and also resources. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script, and special thanks to Peter and Anna for sending me Japan's Imperial Army, Jack for the Battle of China, and Michael for sending me the Service of the Emperor. Also thank you to all my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar that added funds for various other books used here. As always, sources are linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.